Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front is a very German book about a very German problem. And yet, in spite of that, it's read all around the world, including in many public schools. This isn't to say that the book is unworthy of its success, as All Quiet is an excellent work of literature. It's just that its themes and subject matter aren't as universal as its popularity would suggest. So I figured that it would be fun to compare it to Ernst Junger's The Storm of Steel. It's a first-hand account by another World War I veteran about his time in the war. However, it's not just a historical document, but a real work of literature. This is because Junger's commentary often enters the realm of psychology and even philosophy. So let's find out how these two works stack up. You can call me Ezekiel. This is All Quiet on the Western Front versus The Storm of Steel. Let's jump in! In just the first few pages, two major differences between these works make themselves clear. The first is their genre. All Quiet on the Western Front is a work of fiction heavily inspired by the author's experience of the war, while The Storm of Steel is a non-fiction memoir. The other major difference comes from their starting points. All Quiet starts a good way into its protagonist's experience in the war. This is important because it helps to establish the story's tone early. In All Quiet, the characters are exhausted by and disillusioned over the war. These men join due to a combination of patriotic fervor and peer pressure, but now every one of them is just tired and wants it all to end. They've come to view their past selves as naive idiots, and have developed a contempt for many of the adults back home, men who not only failed to protect them, but outright exploited them. Meanwhile, Ernst Junger chooses to begin his memoir right before his first combat encounter. But in terms of quality, All Quiet starts much stronger than The Storm of Steel. In fact, Storm of Steel really only gets good in its second half. Speaking of openings, All Quiet in the first few pages chooses to bring up a very interesting subject. On just the third page, the book describes a character like this: Lear, who wears a full beard and has a preference for the girls from officers' brothels. He swears that they're obliged by an army order to wear silk chemises and to bathe before entertaining guests of the rank of captain and upwards. You see, prostitution was a major part of the soldiers' lives. These young men were stuck in a situation where they could die at any moment. Well aware of that fact, they weren't going to let themselves die virgins. But when the war ended, many veterans chose to compartmentalize and forget about that part of their lives. Erich Maria Remarque, however, was not willing to let that happen. But truth wasn't the only motive for this line's inclusion, especially since it's so early in the novel. Remember, All Quiet was published in the 20s, so a person from back then reading something like that so early in a book would probably have had a real shock. Perhaps Erich was trying to give his readers a taste of what he and his comrades experienced. But sex and how the war changed it isn't relegated to the book's opening pages. It's a theme throughout the whole work. I particularly remember a scene where the protagonist describes how Russian POWs were so poorly treated that they lost their sex drives entirely. All of this is in stark contrast to Ernst Junger's approach to the subject, as he really doesn't talk about it. And since we're back to The Storm of Steel, I'd like to talk about its various editions, since this book has a lot of them, and most are radically different from each other. The first edition was literally just Junger's war diary. The second edition, the one on which the English translation I used was based, is a full-on memoir. Overall, I was quite happy with it, although there was a shocking number of spelling and grammatical errors. Not enough to be a problem, but definitely enough to be noticed. So with that understood, let's get back to our comparison. So I described All Quiet as a very German book about a very German problem. Why is that? Well, the book is very anti-war. Now, that's a pretty fair position to have. War is probably best avoided when possible, but it's down to why. You see, many of the countries involved in World War I felt they had pretty darn good reasons to go to war. The Austrians saw themselves as avenging the assassination of the heir to their throne. The Serbs saw the war as a fight against unprovoked imperial aggression. The Russians saw themselves as defending an ally and fellow Slavic nation. The French had a bunch of reasons, ranging from revanchism to defending their own allies. But in my opinion, the Belgians had the best reason. Germany straight up invaded them just because they were in the way. That's some BS right there. But what about the Germans? They kinda just accidentally walked into the war. And while sure there were strategic reasons to destroy the Entente, the average soldier on the ground really didn't care about that sort of thing. So with no real stake in the conflict, many German soldiers would become increasingly bitter as the war dragged on. It's this environment that shaped Erich Maria Remarque's view of the war, and of war in general. Interestingly, the British were in quite a similar position. The war was an accident for them too, since they were only there to honor a decades-old guarantee of independence to the Belgians. So the average British soldier, just like his German counterpart, saw the war as kind of pointless. After all, what did he care about Belgium for? As a result, the United Kingdom and Germany have developed a sort of mutual cultural friendship over this shared experience. I can't help but notice that whenever discussing or depicting the conflict, British and German veterans and media always make a point of saying that they feel no animosity toward one another. This is presumably much to the upset of their former allies, who did in fact feel quite a bit of animosity toward one another. All of this is what leads me to say that All Quiet is just so German. It's not a universal experience of war, it's a specific nation's experience of a specific war. Had the war been one of defense against a hated enemy, then All Quiet would probably have turned out differently. I mean, again, just imagine if a Belgian had written it. But that's not to take away from the fact that All Quiet is a truly excellent book. So now that we've established All Quiet is thoroughly anti-war, let's take a look at Younger's view of the matter. The Storm of Steel is very pro-war for two reasons. The first is that Younger considers war to be one of the ways the civilization progresses through historical dialectic. When describing an important battle, Younger uses the phrase, the destiny of nations. To him, war's simply a way history progresses, so there's no sense in being angry at it. Second, Younger sees war as an opportunity for personal development. A motif that shows up often is a certain apathy toward his own death. Younger just doesn't see dying as such a bad thing so long as he performs his duty. This attitude makes sense for a volunteer like Younger, and is the opposite of the conscripts and peer-pressured volunteers of All Quiet. But the thing that stands out the most is that Ernst Younger seems to just love warfighting. His memoir is full of daring missions and heroic actions, as well as, of course, all the men that get killed along the way. So it makes sense that he'd support the wars that make combat possible. Although this isn't to say that he enjoys the suffering and destruction war causes, he seems to find that quite regrettable. But in the end, all of that risk-taking clearly paid off, since Younger became a lieutenant very quickly and was extremely well decorated, earning all sorts of impressive medals, and even living to be, oh my god, 102 years old? You know, maybe he was right about war being good for personal development. Anyway, it's now time for what is, in my opinion, the biggest difference between these two works. It's not pro-war versus anti-war, rather, it's how those themes affect their work's tones. From start to finish, All Quiet on the Western Front is a miserable book. Erich Maria Remarque makes clear that war is bad, and wants you not just to know it, but to feel it. Anytime a character could experience joy, it's ruined for him by the war, usually by a negative psychological effect like PTSD or depression. Ernst Younger, on the other hand, wants you to experience all that he experienced. Sometimes that was misery, but other times it was bravery, terror, pride, tragedy, and in many cases, joy. Joy is a feeling that's totally absent from All Quiet, but is not uncommon in The Storm of Steel. Overall, both books are excellent works of literature about the First World War. In terms of overall quality, All Quiet on the Western Front is clearly better, but in terms of philosophy and concepts that'll apply to your lives, like musings on leadership, war, and the meanings of duty and death, The Storm of Steel is the better work. So before I go, I'd like to leave you with an anecdote from The Storm of Steel. It takes place in March of 1918. That month would decide the fate of the world. Russia had already left the war, but the Americans were coming. If Germany wanted to win, it had to end the war then. So the whole nation would put all of its strength into one final spring offensive. Ernst Younger describes what it felt like to be there, right at the beginning of the assault. The decisive battle, the final advance, had begun. The destiny of nations drew to its iron conclusion, and the stake was the possession of the world. I was conscious, if only in feeling, of the significance of that hour, and I believe that on this occasion, every man felt his personality fade away in the face of a crisis, in which he had his part to play, and by which history would be made. And so, in all that grandeur and scale of the giant First World War, Ernst Younger's own story continued to play out. In that great 60-kilometer advance, once thought impossible in trench warfare, Ernst found himself in an enemy trench, and waiting for him there was a wounded enemy soldier. He approaches to finish him off. But then, something strange happens. Younger describes the scene. A drama without an audience was ready. To me, the mere sight of an enemy in tangible form was a release. Grinding my teeth, I pressed the muzzle to the temple of this wretch, whom terror now crippled, and with my other hand gripped hold of his tunic. With a beseeching cry, he snatched a photograph from his pocket and held it before my eyes. Himself, surrounded by numerous family. I forced down my mad rage and walked past. And that's All Quiet on the Western Front versus The Storm of Steel. Up next, we're going to compare two more books, both about certain atrocities that transpired as a direct result of the First World War. I'll see you then.
Pack up your troubles in your own, kick back and smile, smile.